to the committee meeting for March. March.
Let's take that one from the top, please.
Welcome to the committee meeting of the Board of Education for October 26, 2021. This meeting is now called to order. Mrs. Smith, can we have a roll call, please?
Okay. Mr. Rich?
I am here.
Ms. Heinrich?
Here.
Mr. Walker?
Here.
Ms. Fox?
Here.
I myself here. Ms. Weems?
I am here.
You have a quorum.
Thank you. We will get started knowing that we have Dr. Blau joining us very shortly. Before we get started, do we have any public comment? I'll go check the other room. Thank you, ma'am. Seeing all of these folks in the room, is there any public comment? Seeing none so far, good morning. The record shall reflect that Dr. Blau is with us, and there is no one in that overflow room. Turn off your cell phones. And we have no public comment, so public comment is now closed. We will now move to our only matter for business today, which is the FPS Proclamation. So just to provide some background, today we're reviewing our proclamation. We're doing this for a number of reasons. First, we've recently conducted an equity audit, so it makes sense for us to revisit our proclamation to see whether we'd like to make any updates or changes based on the equity results. Plus, we have a new board, and it makes sense for us to, as a board, consider this proclamation, determine whether it represents what this board wants to establish as a resolution, and or whether we want to reaffirm this. So before we get started, I wanted to provide a little history and help everybody understand how we arrived here, and then provide some space to discuss. So the board was given the proclamation and asked to make some comments. Again, before we get to that, I want to provide a little bit of history. So sometime in the spring of 2020, we began noticing a lot of comments, protests from students, letters, and in-person public comments related to some people's experiences, our student experiences, our staff experiences, and members of our community expressed their views to us and their experiences with us. And it helped the board at that time realize that the board wanted to make a statement in support of our resolve to embed diversity, equity, and inclusion into, our policies and procedures and what we do. And so I'm thankful to our past board members and our current board member, Zach Rich, who sort of spearheaded this effort and developed a proclamation. We had some help from the district. The assistant superintendent at the time, Aaron Johnson, helped to write the original proclamation, which was sent to you in an email. From there, we made some adjustments to it. The board sought some external consultants who helped to draft and provide more detail and more explanation to the proclamation, and it resulted in the proclamation that we have today. So again, we asked the board members to take a look at both of those resolutions and proclamations and provide some feedback. And I have the feedback that I've accumulated from board members so far, and several of you also shared with me some proclamations and resolutions from other districts, which I thought were really helpful. So at this point, I wanted to talk through yes.
Just as a point of clarification, I wanted to make sure everyone got credit for this. Ms. Smith did serve on the policy committee when we crafted the proclamation.
Okay.
Its first time around. I just wanted to make sure that
Thank you.
that was recognized.
Okay, thank you. The board members were given a copy of both of those resolutions and proclamations so that you had some history and some context and you knew what our current proclamation obviously says, and asked to make some comments, suggestions, and provide some feedback. So I've collected that from you. I recognize that the diversity, equity, and inclusion is a pretty sensitive subject for some, and I recognize that there's a lot of confusion about what diversity, equity, and inclusion is and what it is not. It's not critical race theory, it's not about making people feel bad, and it's more comprehensive than just race and ethnicity. And so today we're going to go through our comments, feedbacks, and suggestions, and I wanted to make sure that everyone on the board knows that this is a safe space to make suggestions, comments, and feedback, and no one on the board will receive any negative reaction to another member's comments. We have been very respectful of each other in that way. Speaking for myself, I'm happy to start with some overall thoughts and feedback based off of what I've heard from other board members and also what I've noticed myself. I think that last year when we put this resolution together, that we did it with very good intentions. I think now reflecting back on it a bit, I know that when I hear about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I know that many people's first thought is around race or ethnicity, but it's so much more than that. And I think school districts have and can broaden their approach to DEI, and I think we have an opportunity to do that with our proclamation. So that was my first sort of overall feedback with respect to that. I'd like to see our proclamation address people with chronic health problems, disabilities, physical ailments, gender identity, mental health issues, all of these groups have a right to an equitable, accessible educational opportunity, and I'd like to see that updated and reflected in our proclamation. I also think there's an opportunity to maybe streamline it a bit. It's rather lengthy. It's very comprehensive, and I understand the genesis from where a lot of that came from, but I think that there is an opportunity to pare it down just a little bit. So that was my feedback. I'd like to open it up to my board members. I've been speaking for a long time, and I'm going to be quiet now and listen. Dr. Blau.
I'm not sure if you mentioned this in your listing of some of the other peoples who we'd like to include in this kind of proclamation. I know Dr. Goodrum frequently speaks of differing ability learners, and so I would add that to the list of people whose unique needs we attend to.
Mr. Rich.
So I definitely recognize all of that. One thing I want to bring up is, when looking at when this was brought forward, these were some of the conversations that were discussed in the policy committee meetings. A lot of this was mainly focused on race due to the current situation in the country, especially a year ago, where we were and everything that was happening on the national stage and international stage. And so while, yes, definitely looking at differently abled people, looking at religion, looking at economic standing, things like that are important things to look at. That wasn't the purpose of this particular proclamation. This one was specifically about race overall. And while we definitely need to be working on these other areas, that was the purpose of this particular proclamation. If we want to do others that focus on other areas, I think that would be fantastic. I would be all ears and more than happy to work on those. But when, there's a reason there are thousands upon thousands of laws out there, right? Is because you can't cover everything in just one. Each needs to be focused on a certain thing, and that's what this was more focused on initially. And so that's my thoughts on it. And looking at it as something to cover everything was not the purpose of it at the time.
That's helpful context.
That's a really good point, and last year worked on an anti-racism resolution for another organization, and that was exactly the decision that was made by that organization, is that, well, this particular resolution is just for anti-racism, and we have or can establish other proclamations for other things. So that's something that we would need to decide as a group. Do we want this to remain specifically focused on race, or do we want to expand it to include others, or do we want to, so do we want to have multiple, or try to make this all inclusive? And that's just something for us to determine.
Any other thoughts or suggestions or pieces of feedback? Go ahead, Ms.
Yeah, so I think the work that's been done here with the resolution is quite amazing, actually. I like it a lot. What I would like to see in the comments that I have placed on my Google Doc is to make whatever we decide is to make the proclamation or the resolution operable, so that it is intended, while it won't be added into the actual documentation, but to ensure that it's an operational piece and not something we're just going to hang up on the wall. So I would like to see, if there's not policies in some of those areas, to update those and make them more current policies, and hopefully through the central office to be able to measure those operational ideas and measure them to see whether or not we're actually doing what we say we want to do.
Mr. Rich?
Sure. And then, Ms. Fox, I just sent you the link for the full resolution. I think what you had been making the comments on was the resolution that was first presented in June. Mm-hmm. And so that was one of the biggest issues that I had with it, was that it was essentially kind of a window dresser type thing that didn't do anything. And so that's what brought us to then making that 2-page proclamation, which actually had the what are we doing, what actions are being taken, so that we actually do something about it, and it's not just something to hang on the wall. And so I just sent you the link for the full proclamation, which I think answers a lot of the questions that you had.
Oh, I do have
on the.
I do have the full proclamation.
Okay.
Is this yours? I have it. I have it right here.
Yeah, right there. Okay.
Yeah, with notes and everything. So I thought the resolution would be what we would be working through. The resolution is what I thought as well today. So is that not?
So the resolution, what you'll see is almost all of it, not all of it, is entirely word for word embedded in the proclamation that was done a few months after the resolution was brought forward. And so the proclamation was an expansion on the resolution that was initially done.
Yeah. So it looks like I did do the resolution, but in paper, I also made those same kinds of things. So if you could just, mentally transfer that over to the proclamation. But the point that I'm making is that it needs to be an operational live document, that we are actually doing what we're saying we're doing, and that we're measuring what we say that we're going to be doing to determine how successful we're going to be at these particular items.
Mrs. Smith?
Thank you, Ms. Weems. To piggyback off of Mr. Rich, we did have some very serious issues before we shut down, and they needed to be addressed at the time. When the Constitution was written years ago, and the Bill of Rights and everything, there were a group of people that got together and wrote those things. And they just didn't keep going back changing or what have you. I am a firm believer in you walk the talk, you walk the walk, you talk the talk. So I don't want to see a resolution, whether it's regarding race, students that are socially or emotionally unhealthy, or the LGBTQ community not acknowledged, or even our minority students. If we're going to do these proclamations, we should not be just doing them because they look good. We don't need them hanging on walls or saying we put this in place just to shut people down. We have to look at all spectrums. If we are going to do these, they need to be enforced. They need to be enforced to look out not only for our staff, but as what we were elected to do is look out for students. So that's where I'm at. I have seen much progress with this cabinet here and with the new superintendent. So it's not like this has just been put on the shelf like a brand new pair of products that I decided not to wear. It's being done. And I'm enjoying the feedback that I'm seeing. There are people that are taking the responsibility of not only looking out for these students, but they're looking out for the staff as well. That may be LGBTQ, they may have race issues. So changing things and adding, I have no problem with. But I want, if we're gonna do these, we must enforce them. Thank you.
So, Mrs. Heinrich.
Go say what you're going to say.
Oh, no. What I was going to do, and just so that folks can get prepared, I would like to hear from our district professionals. I would like to hear from our superintendent, and I would like to hear from our diversity, equity, and inclusion leader to, help us understand what they've seen as far as, what other districts are doing, what really is the aim and the focus of a resolution, of a proclamation, what is the purpose there, and make sure that we're all level set and on the same page with respect to what belongs in a proclamation or a resolution versus what belongs in policy and what gets operationalized. I think it would be helpful to get some of that, but I want to make sure that we hear from all of our board members, and I wanted to make sure that you were prepared that I would be going to you next, Dr. Delgado. So it sounds like Mrs. Heinrich has some feedback, and then Mr. Walker, and then Dr. Blau.
Yeah, I just am looking and listening to the comments, and it's just trying to piggyback on what you said, just to understand, do we want to revisit and streamline, because there are suggestions, or do we want to just reaffirm what was written and then move forward? If need be, then add another proclamation. I mean, it's like, right now it says proclamation, and first suggestion based on Mr. Rich's remarks was maybe we should amend the title, Proclamation on Racism, because he pointed out that it was written to address specifically racism, and then separate it from there, because I could go through and spend a couple hours on going through and condensing things, rewording things, and it sounds like that might not necessarily be our task. So just to clarify, what exactly do we want to accomplish in this objective?
Mr. Walker was next.
I think I land where some of you are as well. And what exactly is the function of a proclamation? I was there when this was drafted, as a community member. I understand the response that this was brought forth to address at that time. But as I read through this, it becomes inclusive of a lot more in addition to what it was originally put together to address as well. So if we are, and I don't mean to be crass when I say this, but if the proclamation is more or less a marketing tool that specifically just lets the world know what it is that we stand for, what it is that we stand against, we can find that information in a vision statement and a mission statement crafted equally as well. if we're going to get into a proclamation that is putting forth our value in terms of how we're going to treat our students and how we're going to treat our staff. Because we're not, make no mistake, I understand clearly the environment that we as a country are in. I understand clearly the environment that people of color face on a daily basis, because I face it myself as a person of color and as a male, a black male. That being said, as a board member and as a board, our responsibility is to the whole. And so therefore, a document such as this, I think, needs to be as inclusive as possible. If we're going to get down to operationalizing the document, that falls then, I think, underneath the purview of the superintendent and his board to make sure that in this proclamation, we have created such language that if, as it says here, whereas the board is committed to eradicating systematic racism, bigotry, discrimination, hate, and violence of any form, then we would look at the superintendent and his board and his policies to address those particular issues according to that kind of statement in such a way that it addresses it appropriately. So whether it's a racial incident, it gets addressed that way. Whether it's a sexism incident, it gets addressed that way. Whether it's one against our extra special population, it gets addressed that way. But in order to allow us that flexibility that nobody, I hate to use the term, feels left out, but we are inclusive, then I think we need to consider language in this proclamation that throws that blanket out there, again, underneath the thought process of what exactly is this for? Is it for marketing, or is it to provide additional direction to Dr. Delgado and his team about what our values are and where they need to lie? Because if it's that part, then I don't know why we can't do that through the vision statement and a mission statement as well. So, my thoughts.
Dr. Blau? I was just going to say something very similar to what you just said, Mr. Walker, about that we set the policy, but then it's up to the superintendent and his team to operationalize it, to implement it. So thank you for clarifying that so eloquently. I'm wondering two things. One, it seems to me we could potentially, if we don't feel comfortable ultimately making this particular proclamation, an equity proclamation, for instance, we could have this stand as an anti-racism proclamation and then create a second proclamation that is an equity proclamation, even if there's overlap. So I don't know which direction we'll decide to go, but I think either would, are options. The other thing I wanted to mention is, since we are taking another look, or we're revisiting this proclamation, I would really love to get some community input. Whether it's the communications committee having some coffees, times, or whatever, or if it's an online opportunity, but I would love for us to give the community opportunities, whether it's students, teachers, parents, to give us some input on what they think about this and what they'd like to see. Mr. Rich?
Just two things quickly. I know definitely having that community input is important, and there was 2 months of time for the community to give their input when this was first brought up. And whatever we hear moving forward, as much as you like to, someone might want to govern with hindsight in 2020. You have to go forward with what you have when you have it. And so that's, whether it's community input on this or a different proclamation is one thing. And then just answering just quickly on the good points that Mr. Walker brought up, which are, what is being done to operationalize, what's the board's role and things like that. A lot of that second page and the now therefore be it resolved, a lot of that verbiage is the board authorizes the superintendent to, the board directs the district to, because it's not the board doing it outside of participating in a series of trainings over the next year, including implicit bias and equity training, then, things that this board is taking those steps to do. And so, it's a lot of different things and things at the time. We have a very different board. We have a very different administration here in place right now than a year ago.
Mrs. Smith?
I want to respectfully disagree with you, Dr. Blau, as far as having the community input. With the climate that we are in now, with race relations, we will not make anyone happy. Being a biracial person myself, I don't think that us opening up this to the community, having one group of people saying they want one thing and then others are offended, then another group saying something. I think that we are a governing board, and I think that we should leave it up to Dr. Delgado and his cabinet to do what we feel would be best. And because our community right now has a lot of passion about what they're fighting for. Whether we agree with them or not, there are people that look like me, they have a passion, whether the other side doesn't agree or not. But at the end of the day, we love our community. But what will happen is you will bring people from both sides, and we have had a community where we have had no problems. There are other communities that have had them. And most of the time, those are people from the outside that comes in and tear our community down, and we're looking at our law enforcement getting involved in things that really we shouldn't have to have all of that going and taking place. Then what happens is when those outsiders leave, we have to rebuild and regroup. So as far as I understand I do agree that we do need to hear from our students and our staff. But as far as, and I don't want any community member to be upset with what I'm saying, but we want to be able to service all. Now, will everybody be happy? Absolutely not. But at the end of the day, a community dialogue or forum, I think that is not our place to do. I think that is up to the superintendent and his cabinet, and that is for us to stay out of and respect what they bring to us. Thank you.
So it looks and sounds like to me that everyone seems to be interested in being inclusive. There's an interest in an equity statement perhaps that is more inclusive. The question I think before us is whether we make adjustments to the current proclamation that we have or let that live and pursue a separate resolution or proclamation that is more comprehensive. At this time, if you wouldn't mind, Dr. Delgado, I would be really interested in your thoughts and perspectives.
Sure, my pleasure. So when I read this proclamation for the first time, really a proclamation to me is a statement of values. It's a statement of what you as a school district, as a school board believe. And the most salient point for me in this first page is the whereas that says children begin their lives without hatred and bigotry. And that if we want to sustain that, we have an obligation as a school district to teach students about acceptance, respectful civil discourse, which was one of the first things I said at my first board meeting about the role modeling that we as adults in this polarized world should be doing a better job of showing our children what respectful civil discourse is, and that can and should happen in schools with debates, of course, around curriculum. And also in the clause it talks about teaching inclusion. So that is our role in schools, is to teach character education, to teach these values in addition to the curriculum. The second piece is, the second page is a full page of really actionable items where you as a school board are directing the superintendent as well as the administration to implement several of these aspects, which I know I'll ask Dr. Goodrum in a moment to share some of the progress that we've made on these. I believe that these are ambitious and admirable goals that we're already working on. I don't feel that we need any additional enhancement or additional proclamations to help us further the mission that we've already begun. So we've already begun to work on the incorporation of diversity, equity, and inclusion aspects into our strategic plan. As you know, of the 8 subcommittees, 3 of those are equity-specific strategic planning, and the whole umbrella of the strategic plan is inclusive of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I don't believe we need any more to know our marching orders, and we're doing the good work and pleased to do that in a large community group. But I understood, you know, having lived in the community, I understood some of the challenges that had happened that certainly were exacerbated by our political climate over the last few years. This was, I interpret it as Mr. Rich said, this was an anti-racist proclamation. This was about race and about race relations in our community and in the school district, and our very intentional and proactive efforts to provide healing for our community. And so, I'm pleased to continue the good work. At this time, possibly I could ask Dr. Goodrum if you can just share a little bit about some of the progress that we've made towards these very actionable directives from the board.
Good evening. Or I guess it's still afternoon for 26 more minutes. Good afternoon. So before I get started, this has basically been the document that I've been working from since I accepted the position of Assistant Superintendent for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion last September or August. To the point that the second page contained many action items, we have done some work. We have made a great deal of progress, actually, toward many of those action items. But if I could, just in reflecting upon some of the needs that we had last year and policies, I do feel there are some issues with clarity of language. And you know, as I expressed, like in reading it, understanding, having lived and been a staff member and experienced and worked with students during this time, and understood the climate. So just the name, the Farmington Public Schools Board of Education Proclamation is, it starts there with the lack of clarity in language. Because it's a proclamation and there are resolutions, I think that it is important that they be able to stand the test of time. So when we include things like specific student percentages and things of that nature that are always changing, like right now, I don't know that our community is aware of it, but let's say our white population is 49% at this time. So we are now a district that is the majority people of color. But regardless of what you all decide about making it an anti-racism proclamation or an equity proclamation, it's important that you know that the Farmington Public Schools, we will always be inclusive of all students. So regardless of what this piece of paper says, when we talk about equity, diversity, equity, and inclusion, we are talking about all children, all staff, all families, all the time. And so when we talk about metrics and the things that we're doing in each of these areas, for instance, a big piece of it was the equity audit, which, you know, we did do. But as a point, one of the points in the resolution talked specifically about the audit addressing, it said outcome gaps, or it may have said achievement gaps. And I was looking at that, just because the equity audit was actually looking at, you know, those 5 different areas, none of which was achievement. Like, they looked at the actual evidence-based practices that lead to improved achievement or improved outcomes for all students. And just as you think about it, as you all are considering this, when we talk about outcomes, we're not just talking about achievement data. We're also, especially right now, looking at how our students are doing with their mental health. You know, how are they doing socially? You know, how are the affective pieces of their lives going on well? But so we continue to do the things that we have always done, like the diversity conference. We were able to have that virtually last year. We still have clubs in all of our schools. We're still participating with MSAN. We still have, we've begun again meeting with our staff, the Black Affinity Group. So we've had a couple of meetings so far this year. So we've been doing ongoing training with all staff, leadership, and through leadership meetings, principal meetings, and staff meetings. We've been doing training that's specific to the results of the equity audit, as far as what we need to change and things that we can improve. So we have done all of that. We've done some training with the board, and I know the board has done some independent training as well. There are just, as we met before, I did have some questions about like Section 2. Was there something specific that you all wanted to see done with that? And there are other places where the resolution has a certain timeline for certain things, and just, again, for proclamation or resolution, you kind of want it to be, if we're saying by next year, but it's a resolution that's supposed to be our standing framework of how we look at what our values are and what we want to make sure happens for all of our children in our district. I hope that made sense.
That is helpful. Any comments, thoughts from board members? Mrs. Heinrich and then Mr. Rich.
I always have comments, so anyways, I'm just listening to everything, and so it seems like the first decision is, do we want this to be a living document that's subject to review and revision? And then we can spend a lot of time debating the verbiage, but that really is not necessarily the point, because it doesn't matter who's sitting on the board always represents the same school community with the same vision, policy, mission statement. And so I like what Dr. Delgado said about a statement of values, which it is. And so the question is, do we want to just let that stand, or do we want to make it a living, breathing document? And I also like what Dr. Goodrum said as far as, I saw just reading it some things for clarity, but, to stand the test of time too. So that is also a point that we want to bring into consideration.
Mr. Smith.
You got this one. So, a few things on this, and Dr. Goodrum, after first coming on in this role, as well as in the role of interim superintendent, while still being able to focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, maybe not with all of your time, because you had something else that you were doing as well, like running the district. There were important things that you brought up involving verbiage and how things were stated, which are extremely important, such as the words be and being, saying that, whereas in being anti-racist, whereas declaring ourselves to be an anti-racist institution, that would be kind of glorifying things a little bit. What Dr. Goodrum brought up a lot of is it is striving to be. Saying that we are is a little bit, disingenuous. It's not accurate. It is something that we are continuing to work on and will continue to work on. But to say that we are at this point in time, and especially at the time of the creation and passage of the document, wasn't necessarily the case. And then just the other thing I definitely understand with with some of the whereases, I know people had questions on, the specific data and history behind it. A lot of times with how these are written, it is you need to set the groundwork of where are we at this point in time, why is this being written now? And so that's kind of why that's included. We can definitely change things up how people wanted, if this was changed, as has been talked about in the past already. This is work that is currently being done by this administration and the district and by the board. And so whether we change it one way or another, I would love to see it be reaffirmed, and we could reaffirm it under a different title. We could give it a different title and perhaps add some clarity there as well.
I actually like the idea of, at a minimum, clarifying the title. I think that is important to recognize that this is specific to race. And I'm really glad that you helped me remember the history here and how this came into being. It is specific to race. It was intended to be specific to race given the issues that we were having. So I recognize that and agree with that. I think what we need to agree on is whether we want to update this beyond the adding more clarity areas for other groups, or if we all acknowledge how this came into being and want to honor, the origin of this document and let it live as a statement around our values around race and ethnicity.
I just have a clarifying question, and that is, was this document developed and approved before we had a superintendent of equity?
Yes.
So it sounds like we are moving in this direction, that this was used before we had direction through an equity policy or an equity department.
I'm sorry. We did have an equity department.
Yeah, I'm sorry, before we had a leader in the equity, before Dr. Goodrum took that seat.
Yeah,
We
I
did have a
know that
person who
Naomi was a part of that, but
responsible for that area. It wasn't their primary work, though.
Yes, okay, thank you.
Two thoughts. One is, I'm wondering if some of the history and the statistics, like the reason behind why this proclamation was written and why it was written this way, specifically as an anti-racism resolution, within the context of what was going on in our community and in our country at that time, is it possible to have like an introductory paragraph or two as part of the proclamation that would provide that context?
That's exactly where I was going with that.
So what I would recommend on there is not putting it in the proclamation, but having it like, here's the link to the proclamation or wherever it is, having that two paragraph or one paragraph, whatever, right above it.
Exactly.
Saying,
Exactly.
this below is a product of this.
Apologies for speaking out of turn, but that's exactly where I was going with this. And really, it's birthed out of your statement, President Williams, about this being a statement of our values. Getting back to my question about what is this for? Because between the work that Dr. Goodrum is doing, the leadership of our superintendent, the directives we've given him the moment he decided he wanted to be the superintendent of this district, all of these measures have been made clear through our policy, through our conversations, and some other matters along the way, that this is just a general statement reflective of a snapshot in time, not minimizing the situation in any way, shape, or form. I want to be very clear about that. But this is in response to a snapshot in time, then I think it needs to live, breathe, and be contextualized, if I can use the term that way, in that manner, so that people understand that this is how, at minimum, people will begin to understand this is how this board responds to situations like that. Bring up another situation like that, and we'll respond in kind. But as far as our overall values and how we're going to operate and how we're going to deal with our staff and our students and so forth and so on, if that's not already been peppered throughout everything that we do with our equity audit and the conversations we've had with our superintendent and the like, and everything else that's going on to strategic planning, you can't figure out in communications, the difference between what is being offered up by Dr. Goodrum and her equity audit communication elements and the ones coming out of the strategic plan. They link so well together. So I think we've got that area addressed. So I would like to see clarity in the document, context that reference the snapshot in time from which this comes from, and in some way, language that would indicate to someone who reads it, this is how this board responds to large-scale situations like that. That would be my thought.
Mrs. Smith, and then I want to address the clarity issue that you just brought up.
First, Dr. Goodrum, thank you so much for all the work that you've done, and to the cabinet, as well as to Dr. Delgado. We had 170 students that wrote an email last year that caused this. So, I'm going to address the elephant in the room. There were 170 students of all ethnicities and backgrounds that caused us to have this conversation and to do this. If we would have had another 170, that would have been a graduating class. So let's just do the math here. We had and I'm gonna continue to say that so it can sink in, 170 students from a high school that complained of how they had been treated because of their ethnicity. And some didn't even experience it, but it was their friends that experienced this. So it was these students that came forward. So there was no way that we could turn a blind eye or a deaf ear to what these students were asking us to do. We were elected to do something to help our students, not just say, oh, this is going to go away or that's going to go away. And the other elephant in the room that I will address. This happened during the time that George Floyd lost his life. So these students were frustrated, they were angry. So they had no other way of reaching out but through this staff and through this board. And I commend not only Mr. Rich for taking the lead on being over this, but some of these people that are sitting in this audience that were still in this cabinet helped us as well. And now we have a superintendent that will make sure this goes through. So we're going to make sure not only will we be looking out for the students, because what you don't understand is this messes with your heads. I have 3 girls that went through this district that have gone through this. I myself have gone through this. And so now we have a superintendent in place that will make sure that our students are going to be safe. We have a cabinet that are going to make sure that these students and staff are going to be safe. No one should have to just come here, go to school, and just go home and never want anything to do with this school district anymore. We have a phenomenal district. And if I might say so myself, and I don't get a check for it, we got a good superintendent and a good cabinet. So do I believe that this work will be done? Absolutely. So to keep, messing with this hamster in a wheel, let's just move forward and get what we have to get done and take care of the students and the staff of this community.
So in the interest of time, I'd like to see if we can get consensus on a few things. It sounds to me as if it sounds like the board is interested in maintaining the proclamation that we currently have. Okay. It sounds like there may be some areas where further clarity is needed, and that is where I will ask the district, specifically Dr. Delgado, if we could get some help from you and Dr. Goodrum in helping us identify where clarity might be needed. And then we can decide whether we can provide that clarity either by amending and reaffirming this, or whether there's an opportunity for us to provide clarity and dialogue. Does that sound like a good plan? And it sounds like we don't have, we feel like the diversity, equity, and inclusion work that we're already doing through our strategic planning provide for the value that we want to create in those areas where a proclamation or resolution in those areas is not needed at this time. Does that sound reasonable? I'm seeing nods. Dr. Blau?
Yes, I concur with all of what you just summarized for us, President Weems. I think, Mabel, you articulated it really well when you spoke of how equity is already clearly articulated as a core focus, district-wide, for the board, for teachers, for staff, for students. So there isn't a need for a proclamation because that's already part and parcel of so much of what we've already got in motion. And, you know, also, Donald, what you were saying about it being, you know, a sort of a snapshot, how our board responds to something going on in the world at a particular time, that wasn't really addressed by our other policies and so forth. And also, Angie, out of respect for all of those students who spoke out at that time, I would really like us to keep it an anti-racism proclamation.
Dr. Delgado?
I can just say two final things, just to get back to Ms. Fox's point on metrics. I believe that the resolution page is so actionable that we can very easily come back, myself, Dr. Goodrum, our team, with periodic reports of showing the action steps and the steps that we've taken towards that. And then just in terms of clarity, I'll work with our cabinet to provide any recommendations for clarity. One that does stick out that Dr. Goodrum alluded to is Section 10 when it talks about the audit should include outcomes for BIPOC students. The more definition of what outcomes are we looking at. And I love, as Mr. Walker said, all of this is dovetailing together. All of our efforts are aligning together. We're getting ready to do the knowledge profile of a learner through KnowledgeWorks and through our strategic plan, which will collectively help us define how do we define success? What are the outcomes we're looking for? What are those metrics? But we will be happy to present periodically those outcomes and align with those metrics.
Mrs. Heinrich?
And just to point out, just listening to the conversation, it is things that we are addressing and moving forward in our board goals. We, you know, have those embedded in our board goals for this school year also. So we are making revisions, or we are taking what this proclamation began, and we are living, breathing, and enacting it throughout the district in so many of the ways, the strategic planning, the cabinet, our board goals. And so I'm comfortable with what you suggested.
Wonderful. Mr. Walker, and then we will conclude.
Just to piggyback, I think that's the true test. If I'm a parent and I'm dealing with a situation similar to what was taking place a little over a year ago, the proclamation isn't where I'm necessarily coming to speak to the district to say, hey, you're not holding up your end of the bargain. It's going to be your policies. It's going to be your procedures. It's going to be your rule, your code of conduct, those kinds of things. While the proclamation is a lofty point in the right direction, a lofty 50,000-foot overview of it, as long as we have those things in place and as long as we have fantastic leadership at the helm making those things happen, which we do, then we are doing and living this document in every way that it would offer, and even perhaps in more ways than it offers.
Thank you, Mr. Walker. Looking like we've come to some consensus here. Dr. Blau?
I just wanted to apologize to Ms. Smith, Ms. Fox, and Mr. Walker for using your first names instead of the proper title.
I didn't hear you. It's a committee meeting, it's a little less formal here. So thank you guys for all of this great input. I think we have a path forward. I think we are okay to adjourn. We've got about 3 minutes before our next meeting starts.
Okay.